360 feet beneath the surface of the Western Mediterranean, a remotely operated vehicle equipped with precision cutting tools approached a corroded steel door that had not been opened in over 100 years. When the divers watching from the surface ship finally saw the vault's interior come into focus on their monitors, what they found was not treasure, not cargo manifests, not the personal effects of a forgotten crew. It was something far more dangerous, a leather satchel containing handwritten survivor testimonies from the night the Titanic sank, accounts collected aboard the Carpathia before she reached New York, accounts that contradicted the official record in ways the men running the inquiries would never have allowed the public to see. The ship everyone forgot, April 15, 1912. The North Atlantic. 1,520 people are dead or dying in 28-degree water, and the world does not know it yet. 58 miles away, a single ship is racing toward them at 14 knots. Her engines are pushed beyond their rated capacity. Her stokers are shoveling coal into furnaces that are already running hot. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, has ordered every non-essential system powered down so that every available pound of steam can be fed to the engines, driving her forward. The heating in the passenger cabins has been cut. The hot water has been shut off. The Carpathia is doing something she was never designed to do, and she is doing it anyway because 58 miles away, people are dying. The RMS Carpathia was not a famous ship. She was not the largest vessel afloat. She was not the fastest. She was a mid-sized Cunard liner, 540 feet long, built in 1902 at the CS Swan and Hunter shipyard in Newcastle, England. She ran a modest route between New York and the Mediterranean, carrying immigrants westward and tourists east. Her passengers were not the Astors or the Guggenheims. They were Croatians and Hungarians and Slovaks crossing the Atlantic for the first time, carrying everything they owned in a single bag. She was, in every conventional sense, unremarkable. What happened in the early hours of April 15th changed that forever. Rostron received the Titanic's distress signal at 12:25 in the morning. He calculated the distance. He calculated his maximum speed. He ordered the course change before he had finished the calculation, because the math was already clear. He could be there by 4 in the morning. Whether there would be anyone left to save was a different question. The Carpathia arrived at 3:45. She spent 4.5 hours pulling survivors from the lifeboats. 710 people were brought aboard. They were wrapped in blankets, given hot drinks, and carried to whatever spare space the Carpathia could offer. First-class passengers gave up their cabins. The dining saloon became a treatment ward. The ship's doctor moved from person to person through a crowd of survivors who were still in shock, still unable to fully comprehend what they had just lived through. And while the Carpathia steamed toward New York, something else happened. Something the official record never fully captured. Something the vault at the bottom of the Mediterranean had been holding for 107 years. The survivors started talking. The official story. You know the version. 2 official inquiries, one American and one British, convened within days of the disaster. Testimony was taken from surviving officers, surviving crew members, surviving passengers. Hundreds of witnesses appeared before committees in Washington and London. The questions were pointed. The answers were recorded. And when it was over, both countries reached essentially the same conclusion. The Titanic struck an iceberg. The collision opened her hull. She flooded and sank. The lifeboats were insufficient to save everyone aboard, but they exceeded the legal requirements of the day. Captain Smith had received ice warnings and had not reduced speed, but this was standard practice in 1912. No criminal charges were filed. No corporation was held liable. The industry implemented reforms and moved on. Case closed. Except the people who were actually there The 710 survivors, who spent 4.5 hours aboard the Carpathia before they were handed over to the official machinery of inquiry, had told a different story first. A story that was collected, documented, and then sealed away before it could complicate the proceedings that were already being organized in Washington. Harold Bride, one of the Titanic's surviving radio operators, gave his first detailed account, not to a government committee, but to a New York Times reporter aboard the Carpathia. That account was fragmentary and partial. What Bride said in private to the ship's officers and to other survivors in the days before the Carpathia reached port was never made part of any official record. Colonel Archibald Gracie survived by clinging to an overturned collapsible lifeboat. By the time the Carpathia reached New York, he had already begun writing down everything he could remember in the order he remembered it, before the fog of shock could soften the edges of what he knew. His published memoir, released months after the disaster, contained details that did not appear in the official testimony he later gave to the inquiry. Not because he chose to omit them, because no one asked. The inquiries were not designed to find the truth. They were designed to find a verdict. And the verdict they needed was one that protected the industry that had built the ship, the government that had regulated it, and the insurance system that would have to pay for it. The survivors who had the most to say were the ones the inquiries were least interested in hearing. The vault on the Carpathia held what they said before anyone told them what they were supposed to say. What the Carpathia carried home. The crossing from the site of the sinking to New York took 3.5 days. The Carpathia steamed slowly through waters still dangerous with ice, and for 3.5 days, 710 people sat with what they had seen and tried to make sense of it. Rostron understood what he had aboard. Not just survivors, witnesses. The only living witnesses to the largest maritime disaster in modern history. He ordered his purser, Ernest Brown, to circulate among the passengers and collect written statements from anyone willing to give one. The instructions were specific. Write down what you saw. Write down what you heard. Write down the time. Write down everything, in order, while you still remember it. What those statements contained has never been part of the public record. Survivors near Boiler Room 6 reported a smell of burning coal so strong it had driven them from the lower corridors. Second and third class passengers described being held below decks by crew members, telling them the lifeboats were not ready, that everything was under control, long after the officers on the boat deck already knew the ship was going down. At least 3 statements described crew members directing passengers from the starboard side to the port side to correct the ship's list, a detail inconsistent with what the physical evidence on the wreck would later show. And then, there were the statements about the speed. Multiple survivors reported being told the ship was trying to set a crossing record, not maintain schedule, set a record. This detail appeared in none of the official testimony. The crew members who might have corroborated it did not survive. Rostron sealed the satchel before the Carpathia docked at Pier 54. He handed it to a White Star Line representative waiting on the dock before the gangway was fully extended. For 107 years, no one outside that chain of custody saw what was inside. The wreck nobody was looking for, the Carpathia survived the Titanic by 6 years. On July 17, 1918, 3 torpedoes fired by the German submarine U-55 struck her in quick succession as she sailed a convoy route through the western Mediterranean. She sank in less than 3 hours. 117 crew members were killed. Captain Rostron was not among them. He had been reassigned earlier that year. The man who pushed the Carpathia beyond her limits to save 710 lives was not present when she went down. The wreck sat largely undisturbed for 8 decades. She appeared on maritime charts as a hazard. Occasionally, she surfaced in dive publications as one of the deeper accessible wrecks in the region. No serious expedition targeted her until 1999, when a team led by Clive Cussler located the wreck using side-scan sonar at approximately 500 feet off the coast of Malta. They confirmed the location, documented the exterior, and went home. The technology to penetrate the interior did not yet exist in a form deployable at that depth. The dive community knew she was there. A small number of expeditions followed, photographing the torpedo damage, the propellers still in place on the stern. But nobody was asking what the interior might contain. The Carpathia was a casualty of the First World War. Her connection to the Titanic was a historical footnote. The researchers who cared about the Titanic were looking at the Titanic, 12,500 feet down in the North Atlantic, not a mid-sized Cunard liner sitting at 500 feet in recoverable water. The vault was there. Nobody was looking for it. That changed when the three-dimensional scans of the Titanic were released in 2023, and a footnote in the accompanying analysis noted that the survivor statements collected aboard the Carpathia had gone down with the ship. She had taken them with her. The technology that changed everything. The expedition that located and opened the vault was not mounted by a government. It was not funded by a maritime museum or a documentary company with a single camera crew and a borrowed ROV. It was a privately organized deep-sea archaeology operation assembled specifically in response to Chorus's research, and it took 2 years to put together. The team was led by marine archaeologist Dr. Sarah Vance, working in partnership with a deep water recovery firm that had spent the previous decade developing remotely operated cutting tools capable of operating with surgical precision at depths where water pressure makes every mechanical action exponentially more difficult. The same basic technology had been used to recover artifacts from wrecked freighters in the Black Sea. Nothing of this scale had been attempted at this depth in a vessel with this level of historical significance. They began with sonar. A full multi-beam survey of the Carpathia's exterior mapped every visible surface of the wreck in 3 dimensions, identifying the structural condition of each deck, each compartment, each surviving bulkhead. The survey took 11 days. When the data was processed, it produced something no previous expedition had ever had: a complete digital map of the interior spaces, still accessible without cutting through primary structural supports. The captain's quarters were intact. The outer door had corroded nearly shut, but the seals had held in a way that almost no one on the surface team had dared to hope. The water pressure at 500 feet, combined with the silt that had settled against the door frame over a century, had created conditions that were closer to preservation than to destruction. Inside those quarters, according to the structural model, a cabinet was still in place against the far wall. The ROV designated for the interior penetration was 42 inches wide, equipped with lights capable of illuminating a 30-foot radius, cameras recording an 8,000 resolution, and 2 articulated arms fitted with tools ranging from brushes to hydraulic cutters, capable of exerting 600 pounds of force. It took 3 days to clear the approach corridor. It took another day to work the outer door. On the morning of the 6th day of active operations, the ROV's cameras pushed through the doorway of Arthur Rostron's former quarters and swept the room for the first time in 107 years. The cabinet was there. Opening the vault, what the cameras showed was not what anyone had fully prepared themselves to see. The room was intact in a way that defied expectation. Silt had settled on every horizontal surface, a soft gray layer that muffled the edges of everything it covered. Rostron's desk was still in place. One corner collapsed where a support had corroded through. A metal frame that had once held a photograph leaned against the wall at an angle, the image inside long destroyed by water. The porthole on the far wall was clouded with a century of marine growth, filtering the ROV's lights into something dim and strange. The cabinet stood against the aft wall. It was bolted to the ship's frame, which is why it had not shifted during the sinking. The door was a simple latch mechanism, the kind used throughout commercial vessels of that era. The latch had corroded completely solid. The ROV's right arm extended a hydraulic tool toward the door. On the surface, the dive team watched their monitors in silence. It took 4 minutes to work the latch free. The door swung outward. Inside, Sitting on the cabinet's lower shelf, exactly where the purser's records indicated it would have been stored, was a leather satchel. The leather had degraded significantly, darkened and compressed by decades of pressure and moisture, but it had not fully disintegrated. The reason was simple and stunning. Someone had wrapped the satchel in oilskin before sealing the cabinet. The oilskin had held, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The ROV's cameras moved to within 8 inches of the satchel. The team on the surface could see that the oilskin was still mostly intact. They could see the outline of the satchel's contents through the wrapping. They could see that whatever was inside was in multiple pieces, individual documents, stacked together, compressed by 107 years of pressure into something closer to a brick than a folder. Recovery took 6 more hours. The satchel was eased from the shelf with tools that had been designed to handle objects of exactly this fragility. It was placed in a sealed container, filled with controlled temperature water, and brought to the surface inside that container. It did not see open air until it was inside a conservation laboratory aboard the surface vessel. When the conservators finally opened the oilskin, what they found inside was not perfectly preserved. But it was legible. Not all of it. Not every page, but enough. Far more than enough. What the testimonies actually said. The statements inside the satchel numbered 53. Some were printed on Carpathia letterhead. Some were written on whatever paper the survivors had managed to find. Some were in English. Some required a translator before the full picture could emerge, and what they said has not been part of the accepted record for 112 years. The speed question came up in 17 of the 53 statements. The standard by which Captain Smith's behavior was judged in both official inquiries was simple. Maintaining near maximum speed through an ice field was normal practice. No reasonable captain could have been expected to do otherwise. But 17 survivor statements described conversations with crew members whose language was not consistent with routine schedule keeping. A first-class steward, named in 2 separate accounts, reportedly told passengers at dinner on April 14th that the ship was trying to arrive early. Not on time. Early. No committee ever asked a crew member about that specific claim, because no committee ever knew the claim existed. The coal fire came next. 8 survivors, some from 3rd class, some crew, described a smell in the lower corridors they recognized as burning coal. 2 of them reported seeing smoke near the forward boiler room entrance. The official inquiries heard testimony that bunker fire had been fully extinguished before the ship left Southampton. The 3-dimensional scans of the wreck say otherwise. The statements in the vault say the passengers could smell it through the corridor walls. But the most significant accounts described what happened on the boat deck. 4 separate statements from passengers who witnessed the evacuation firsthand described officers actively turning people away from lifeboats that still had empty seats. Not because the boats were full, because the officers did not believe the davits could handle the weight of a fully loaded boat. The equipment had never been properly tested. Nobody knew if it would hold. And so boat after boat dropped into the North Atlantic, carrying 30 people when it had capacity for 65, because the men lowering them were afraid to find out what happened if they pushed further. One statement, 4 pages of careful handwriting on Carpathia notepaper, was signed by a 2nd-class passenger named Margaret Devaney. She described watching lifeboat number 1 lowered from the starboard side. Its capacity was 40. The official inquiry established it carried 12. Devaney put the number at 7. She described 2 crew members turning passengers away, one of whom told her the boat was reserved. That crew member later testified at the British inquiry. He was not asked about lifeboat number 1's departure. He was asked about other things. And then there was the note nobody expected to find. Unsigned, plain white paper, placed inside the satchel after the statements were collected. It held a list of 12 names and 3 sentences below them. These accounts have been reviewed. They contain material that is not suitable for public inquiry at this time. They will be retained until such time as their release no longer presents difficulty. Someone had read what was inside and made a decision. Why it was sealed. To understand why the statements were sealed, you have to understand what 1912 actually was. White Star Line was owned by J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company. Morgan had been scheduled to sail on the Titanic's maiden voyage and had canceled his booking days before departure. His company's exposure in the aftermath of the sinking was enormous. The Titanic had been insured for £1 million. The compensation claims from surviving passengers and the families of the dead threatened to far exceed that. The American inquiry was chaired by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, a man with no maritime expertise who was widely mocked by the British press for asking whether passengers could have escaped through the portholes. The British inquiry was chaired by Lord Mersey, a man whose previous service as a shipping commissioner had given him a perspective that the industry he was now investigating found comfortable. Neither inquiry was designed to find that the ship had been negligently built, negligently operated, and sent into an ice field with insufficient lifeboats, because the regulations governing lifeboat requirements had not been updated since 1894. Neither inquiry was designed to find that the men who built the ship knew its rivets were substandard, that the men who operated it knew its coal bunker was on fire, that the men who regulated it had written rules for ships 1/4 its size. The verdicts those inquiries returned were not the result of deception. They were the result of questions that were not asked, evidence that was not presented, and witnesses who understood, before they ever appeared before a committee, what the acceptable range of answers was. The statements in the vault were outside that range. Someone aboard the Carpathia, in the 3.5 days before she reached New York, had read what the survivors wrote and understood that it was dangerous. Not to the truth, to the verdict that had already been decided. This was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something more ordinary and more disturbing. It was an institution protecting itself before it protected the people it had failed. The same calculation had approved substandard rivets in the bow of the Titanic. The same calculation had rejected 48 lifeboats because they would clutter the deck for first-class passengers. The same calculation had not updated lifeboat regulations for 18 years because nobody with power to change them had anything to gain from changing them. Every element of the Titanic disaster was the result of someone deciding that something else was more important than the lives of the people aboard the ship. The sealing of the vault was simply the final version of that decision. The reckoning. The statements cannot prosecute anyone. The men who sealed them are dead. The companies that benefited from their suppression have been dissolved or absorbed or renamed beyond recognition. The legal window for any claim arising from the sinking of the Titanic closed before most of the people who will read the vault's contents were born. What the statements can do is something the official record never did. They can tell the truth about what happened on the boat deck of the Titanic in the early hours of April 15, 1912, in the words of the people who were standing there. They can confirm what the three-dimensional scans of the Titanic wreck have already suggested, that the fire in Coal Bunker 6 was known, was visible, was detectable by smell from the passenger corridors, and was not disclosed. That the speed at which the Titanic was traveling through an ice field on the night of April 14th was not simply standard practice, but was a deliberate choice made by people who had a financial interest in the ship arriving early. That the lifeboats were not loaded to capacity because the men lowering them were afraid, and their fear had been created by an institution that had never adequately tested the equipment it was asking them to use. They can tell us about Margaret Devaney watching lifeboat number 1 disappear into the darkness with 7 people in a boat built for 40, while 1,200 people stood on the deck, above water that was already rising. They can give us the name of the crew member who told her the boat was reserved. They cannot give us back the 1,500 people who died. They cannot undo the 112 years during which the official record was allowed to stand as the final word on what happened and why. But they can do something that the official inquiries refuse to do. They can make clear that what happened to the Titanic was not fate. It was not an act of God. It was not the unavoidable consequence of an iceberg appearing in the dark at the wrong moment. It was the consequence of choices, specific choices made by specific people in specific rooms for reasons that were entirely comprehensible and entirely unforgivable. The vault held those choices in handwritten ink for 107 years at the bottom of the Mediterranean. The technology finally went down to get them. The Carpathia rests at 500 feet. She will stay there. The vault has been documented. The satchel recovered. The statements transferred to a conservation facility where the work of restoring the most damaged pages is still ongoing. What has already been read is already changing the record. What remains to be recovered may change it further. The debris field from the Titanic stretches 3 miles across the floor of the North Atlantic. Shoes still paired where bodies came to rest and decomposed over a century ago. Champagne bottles still corked. A bronze statue that first-class passengers walked past every evening before dinner, thrown to the seafloor when the ship broke apart. The three-dimensional scans captured all of it. The vault on the Carpathia captured something else. The voices of the people who were there. The voices that the official record spent 112 years not quite hearing. We have called this disaster many things. A tragedy, an act of God. The night the unsinkable ship sank. Each phrase does the same work. Each phrase puts distance between us and the uncomfortable reality that the vault has made undeniable. People knew the rivets were substandard. People knew the coal was burning. People knew the lifeboats were untested. People knew the regulations were 18 years out of date. People knew the statements collected aboard the Carpathia said things that the inquiries were not prepared to hear. Knowing and acting are different things. The people who knew chose not to act. That choice was made in a boardroom when the rivets were approved. It was made in a shipping office when the lifeboat proposal was rejected. It was made on the deck of the Carpathia when someone read what the survivors had written and decided that the world was not ready to know. The iceberg has carried the blame for 112 years. It makes a convenient villain. It appeared in the dark, from nature, without warning, without intention. But the iceberg did not seal the vault. The iceberg did not decide which testimony was suitable for public inquiry. The iceberg did not write a list of 12 names on a piece of plain white paper and place it inside a leather satchel wrapped in oilskin. People did those things. People with names and reasons and the power to make choices that other people would never know had been made. The vault is open now. The Carpathia carried the truth home from the North Atlantic in April 1912, and she kept it 360 feet down in the Western Mediterranean for 107 years, waiting for technology that did not yet exist and questions that had not yet been asked. The technology finally arrived. The questions are finally being asked, and the answers are exactly as disturbing as the people who sealed that satchel knew they would be.